So this is the first game of the state tournament. I'm white as a class A and my opponent's class C. He plays e4 and I play the French defense. And recently actually one of my students told me, he said, why do you play the French? It's a coward's opening, which is apparently what his father told him. And it is certainly a very safe, cautious defensive opening, but I don't see the point in playing e5 because that pawn on e5 will be undefended. And since white has the first move, white will have a little bit of an advantage in counterattacking the e5 pawn. So I'd rather play this, and it does allow him to maintain a strong center, sure, with d4, but that's the advantage of the first move. And the point of e6 is now I can prepare a counterattack with d5 to disrupt his center. And so what he does here is he captures my pawn, and I recapture, which is the exchange variation of the French. And there's a lot of arrows here, but the main point is that now everybody tries to develop their pieces as quickly as possible. But usually what they do is they develop the king side first in order to castle. And I did likewise with knight to f6. But looking at the game afterwards, I really think that maybe what I should do is play bishop to d6 rather than just simply mimicking white's move. Because if you look at here, bishop d6, the big difference is that since the bishop is developed, I can now safely play knight e7 or queen e7, and I won't be blocking in my own bishop. And another good reason for bishop to d6 is that it might actually entice him to play knight to e5, because he's likely to think that you're trying to prevent knight to e5, and so he'll conclude that, well, that'll be good, I'll trade a bishop for a knight, and then I'll have a strong pawn on e5, preventing knight to f6. But there's no reason to take that knight. That knight's not actually doing anything at all. It's sitting there. And if we play knight to f6, then we've spent 2 moves to develop 2 pieces, whereas he spent 2 moves to develop 1 piece, and so black here actually has an edge in development. But I played knight to f6, and now he played h3, which is kind of a theoretical mistake. The idea comes from Jules Riviere, who played this during the French national tournament in 1883, and the basic idea is to prevent bishop to g4. But not exactly the best move, because I really have no intention of playing bishop to g4 for several reasons. First off, that the pin is not going to be useful since his f3 knight's not doing anything. Pinning it's kind of pointless. And secondly, it's really easy for him to break the pin by just simply playing bishop to e2. And thirdly, I have no intention of ever trading my light bishop for his knight, because the bishop is better than the knight. So it just shouldn't be a concern for him. But regardless, he plays h3. And I told him after the game it would have been much better to play bishop to d3 and just continue with his development. But he played h3, and oh, that's all screwed up. He played h3, and I played bishop to d6, preparing to castle. And now he followed me playing bishop to d3, and you can see that I've gained the initiative because he played h3. Now I'm moving first. I moved my bishop, and then he moves his bishop. I castle, and then he castles. So I'm actually now kind of leading. I played rook to e8, and if he'd then played rook to e1, I would have traded rooks. But instead he plays bishop to g5. And the bishop's kind of bad for the same reasons my bishop on g4 would have been bad. The knight on f6 not doing anything, so there's no reason to pin it. It is really easy for me to break the pin if I really need to by playing my bishop back to e7. And it would be bad for him to capture my knight with his bishop. And what I should have done at this point is just simply played h6, like Margot Katilga did during the German tournament in 1968. If white now captures on f6, that'll allow my queen to occupy f6. If he plays back to bishop to e3, then he's given me a free move. And if he plays bishop to h4, then his bishop's poorly placed, because if it eventually is forced to retreat to g3, I can capture, and that'll displace his f knight toward the edge of the board. But just kind of playing on autopilot. You know, I just played bishop to e6, which is a good defensive move, but you know, my defense is already good enough. I should have been thinking more aggressively. I suppose if the flaw to the French is that it's so safe, you sometimes kind of feel complacent behind your Maginot line. And he played knight to c3. Once again, I should have played h6. You know, that bishop on g5 is in my territory trying to convert my peasants, and I really need to, you know, insist that they follow the true religion. And now he plays, or I played 6, just continue to develop my position. My students refer to this as a triangle. It's a really solid defensive structure, or it's a pyramid. And he played queen to d2, which doesn't actually accomplish very much. If you look at that diagonal from d2 through g5, it actually goes off the board towards what would have been i7. In contrast, you know, if I put a queen on c7, my queen is aiming towards h2, which is right next to his king. So that's a slightly better diagonal, and I told him after the game, you know, what you really should have done is put your knight on d2, and then you can play your pawn forward to c3, and then your queen can go on c2, supporting your light bishop, which is aiming at h7. Well, I want to put my queen on c7, but what I don't want is to do it immediately, because if I do that, queen to c7, now he can actually take my knight, and my pawn's got to recapture, and then his queen comes down to h6, and I can try to block that threat to h7 by playing f5, but his knight can come in as reinforcement, and that's going to be really bad for black. So before I play queen c7, I got to play knight bd7 to reinforce the knight on f6, and he plays rook fe1, which is an okay move, but it's not doing much because it's really just aiming at that bishop on e6, which is also not doing very much. It's a really defensive structure, but I need to be more aggressive. I continued with queen to c7, controlling that diagonal, and now he makes kind of the first mistake of the game. Bishop to f1 is pretty serious. I'm not entirely sure what his point reasoning was. I guess he wanted to play the bishop to g2 for some reason, but if he wanted that so bad, he should have just played it from the beginning. It's such a waste of time to go to d3 and then to f1, and it really weakens his position because now I can put my bishop on that strong diagonal there between h7 and b1, and so I'm now controlling a second diagonal. And he then continues by playing bishop to e3. Apparently I've intimidated my opponent, and he's now rushing back to just create some sort of kind of defensive structure. And there's really no point to this at all. Bishop's like kind of playing the same role that my bishop was previously playing on e6, but it's not going to be as strong because he doesn't have a pawn on c3, so that d4 pawn is not as strong as my d5 pawn. And here I probably should have played h6, which is kind of a quiet waiting move that will prevent him from returning to g5. At this point, his best move is probably to bring his bishop back to d3, and now I'll play knight to e4, but I immediately played knight to e4, attacking his queen. And right here he should have taken my knight, and the reason he didn't is because I'm sure he was worried about this pawn on e4 that would have been attacking his knight, and he probably wasn't sure, well, where's his knight going to go afterwards. But he can still survive this. Okay, he should actually counterattack against my bishop by playing g4, and I take his pawn, or I take his knight, and he takes my bishop, and then I play my queen d8, trying to get my queen over to his king side, and he can play bishop to g5, blocking my queen, which is why I should have played h6 before I played knight to e4, so that bishop couldn't play to g5. But he doesn't take the knight, and so he just withdraws his queen to d1, and at this point I've got a really strong knight on e4. And after playing knight df6, I can actually replace the knight should he capture it, but I have an even better move than what I played, which is knight df6, because I can play knight to c3, with the idea being that I'm going to put a knight on c4. If you look at this, knight takes, he recaptures. Now I come over here with knight b6, and the whole idea is this knight on b6 is going to wind up on c4, and that means my bishop is not blocked by a knight on e4, so I've got pressure on c2. But I play knight df6, and that knight on e4 is really dominating the position, and he probably should have, played bishop to d3 to try and put pressure on that knight. But he makes a major mistake, which really decides the game. He plays g3. And I guess his plan is to move the bishop to g2 in order to attack my knight on e4. But I can win by sacrificing the bishop, the 6 bishop on g3. And it would actually be wrong to play knight takes g3, because that leaves me without a follow-up attack. If you look at that, knight takes, pawn takes, bishop takes, and rook e2. I traded a knight for 2 pawns, and I actually have a slight advantage because his king is so exposed, but white should be able to defend successfully and get a draw. But the situation's very different after bishop takes g3, because when he recaptures, my queen is going to come into the play. So there's my queen, and he locks with bishop g2, but I can now take that h3 pawn because the bishop's pinned, actually threatening checkmate now on g2. And the best way for him to have defended this was with queen to e2. But I have a winning idea here with knight takes c3. By moving the knight from e4, I've now opened up attack against the bishop on e3 with my rook, and my knight's going to be able to come over to g4. And I can try to somehow defend the bishop by, if he moves to queen to f2, that'll allow a trade of queens, and I'll just wind up with 3 passed pawns on the king's side. He might also try queen to d2, but it's not going to work because I have knight fe4. And if you look now, all those, actually I should have a red arrow right here, all those second rank squares are not safe for the white queen, but yet the white queen needs to defend g2 from checkmate. And he can try to somehow survive this. Bishop f4 is really his only chance, hoping my queen goes away. But I can just stay on the g-file, maintaining pressure on g2. He can even try knight to h2, but my queen just simply falls back to g6, and he still has this problem that there's no safe place for his queen, which allows him to defend g2. And here his best move is actually rook takes e4, but that's clearly not going to be winning. He doesn't play queen to e2 though, he actually plays a slightly worse move, rook to e2, same idea. I have sort of the same continuation. With knight takes c3, I'm attacking both his queen and his knight. And he can't, if he play b takes c3, well if he does, I can actually sack the rook on e3. And if you look at that rook takes, now if he recaptures on e3, I can play queen takes g2 checkmate. And if he ignores that and somehow does something else, then I might also be able to play rook takes f3, because that bishop on g2 is pinned. What he plays next is queen to f1, allowing me to take that c3 knight and allowing me to take the rook on e2. Check. And he really should resign, because there's not going to be much chance of winning this game. According to the computer, there's checkmate within 26 moves. He played queen takes e2, trying to defend his position, but he can't defend the bishop on e3. What I should have probably played here is knight g4. Going to win the bishop, and it also controls the f2 square, preventing him from playing queen to f2 and trying to trade queens. But just effective pretty much is what I actually played. Well, let's look at this for a moment. Knight g4. And here, of course, I'm about to win that bishop. He might play knight to e5 to try and block the line of the rook. But because I played knight g4, I now have the option of queen to h2 check. And king to f1 is forced. And I can follow up with queen to h1 because the bishop on g2 is pinned. And he has to block that with bishop to g1. And now I can actually win his queen because I can play bishop takes g2 check, and if he moves his king, then I'll take the bishop on g1 as well. But if he recaptures with the queen, I'm going to be able to fork with my knight. So bishop takes, queen takes, knight to e3 check, and the king moves. And here it's actually better to capture with the queen rather than the knight, even though that allows white to capture the knight on e3. Queen takes, bishop takes, because I can play f6, and when that knight moves, I'll take the bishop on e3. But I didn't play knight d4 here. Instead, I just immediately played rook takes e3, because if white captures that rook, I can immediately checkmate him on g2. But the weakness of rook takes e3 is it does allow queen to f2, and he then essentially he's still going to lose, but it's a slightly slower win for me because the queens are off the board. I actually at this point just try to trade as much material as I can to go into a pawn ending. So queen takes g2, queen takes, bishop takes, king takes, and now I can win the pawn on c2. King moves, take the pawn. He tries to defend the b pawn. I bring my other rook over. He plays a3, preparing b4 so that his rook is able to move elsewhere. My rook comes up to e2. My rook's really dominant there. There's b4. And here the computer said I had mate in 8 after rook g2, but I played knight to e4 check. He plays king to f4. At that point, I really wanted to play g5 check, but I didn't really like his king coming over to g4, although that really wouldn't have been a problem. So first I played h4, or a5, in order to control the g4 square, but I would have been just fine with g5 check, and if he were to say take that pawn, knight takes g5, I actually play rook f2 check, and if now he plays king to g4, I can play f5 check, and there's like mate in 4, and if he plays king to e5, I can play f6 check, winning the knight. But I played h5, and you see his king's kind of surrounded there. He went and attacked my undefended pawn, but now I played g5 check, and he can't capture the pawn on g5 because of rook f2 check. So there he takes the pawn, rook f2 check. If his king retreats to e3, I have checkmate with rook c3. If he plays king to e5, I have f6 check. In this position, he thought for a little bit, and he picked king up, and he started setting his king down on f5, but he saw the threat knight to g3 check, winning the rook. So then he shifted his king over to e5. But in fact, I have rook on e2, so I have a discovered attack against his king anyways, so I can still play knight to g3 check. His king has to move, and I can win the rook on h1, although the computer says there's a faster win after rook e6 check. But just took the rook. And now, I mean, this position's hopeless, and he plays one of those desperate moves you only see when somebody knows they're defeated, and for some reason they're just not resigning. You know, trying to push his pawn down somehow and promote it, I guess. But I just, ignore that phantom threat. I can just play rook f2, winning the knight. Let him take my pawn, take the knight with check. He takes my pawn. And at this point, I could have just played rook g2 check, which is mate in 3, but instead played b5 and quit writing my moves down at this point because it was just so obvious I was going to win. I don't remember exactly what happened, but I believe his king drifts over to d7, and my queen eventually comes down, perhaps to c6 or so, and checkmates him. And that's the end of the game.